I was saying to the students this morning that if criminal law is a landscape, then I don't think there's any figure that looms larger on it in the Canadian context for longer, with fingers in perhaps more and more interesting pies than Professor Martin Friedland. He has involved himself in learning, researching, teaching, and writing about criminal law since his decision to go to law school somewhere in 1955. And his focus has always been fairness. His approach has always, really a long time ago, become interdisciplinary and historical. And this was long before it became academically fashionable to be that way. And now, of course, it's an essential in considering criminal law questions. He's the author of 18 books, at least by my count, some of which have amazing titles, including things like Access to the Law, which sounds sort of well used now, but again, an incredible concept. The Trials of Israel Lipsky, The Case of Valentine Shortus, The Death of Old Man Rice, a trilogy of sort of criminal law mysteries based on extensive archival research, and a magnum opus, The History of the University of Toronto, which was a book I think that nobody thought could be written, which Professor Friedland managed to produce in time for that university's 175th anniversary. In his latest book, in which he describes his life in crime, which he's going to talk to you about today, he wrote the sentence that I've always wanted to write, and I sort of hate this. I mean, I've got a collection of these sentences that I want to write, and then someone does it so gracefully, there's no point. But he's talking about the fact that Canada so far has not followed the United States, although we have been trying, in enacting 3 strikes and you're out laws. And he characterizes this as one of the most important non-developments in criminal justice in Canada in the last 50 years. When Professor Friedland came to my law school, when I was a first-year student at Saskatchewan, he talked about the origins of the criminal code, and it was a complete revelation to me. I had been sort of at least receiving the impression that law was superhuman and inevitable, that it was somehow a progressively purified product of a mass judicial mind, and that it was always evolving and adapting itself so sweetly and comfortingly around human needs and social change, and that occasionally the legislature would step in, rightly or wrongly, with a little corrective slap to the common law. But no. And I was so delighted to discover this. It changed my entire orientation to law school and to sort of life in the law. Law is made up. It's invented to a degree that I hadn't imagined. It's the product of particular minds at particular times and places. It's motivated by an awful lot of things other than or in addition to justice. And generations to come might pay the price for hasty decisions or bad decisions, for historical chance, and for the very strange deference we give bad ideas because they're old and settled ideas. I'll just say a tiny bit about Professor Friedland's credentials. He is University Professor and James M. Torrey Professor of Law Emeritus at the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto. He holds an impressive number of degrees, beginning with a Bachelor of Commerce degree, which according to this very insightful, or at least lets you kind of peer in, autobiographical work, was not a great success for Professor Friedland in terms of where his heart really was. Of course, the law degree from the University of Toronto, various honorary doctorates, a doctorate from the University of Toronto, an honorary doctorate from Cambridge, no, a real doctorate from Cambridge, I don't know, a PhD from Cambridge as well. He taught at Osgoode Hall at the beginning, which I didn't know, and moved over to the University of Toronto somewhere around 1965. And he spent 1 year as a full-time member of the Law Reform Commission of Canada in its early glory days, before being recalled to service as Dean of Law at Toronto. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society. He's received a number of awards for teaching, for original contributions to law reform and legal research. He is a Companion of the Order of Canada as of 2003. He has received a number of prizes awarded by Criminal Lawyers Association, the G. Arthur Martin Award, the Canada Council Molson Prize in the Humanities and Social Sciences, which is sort of the grail, really, for the rest of us who will not be finding that one. I won't read them all. He currently resides in the south, or in a place south of Queens Quay in Toronto, and I did read your epilogue. The place of residence is still called the Terminal Warehouse. So perhaps not as a place where you put academics coming to the end of illustrious careers, because he hasn't shown any sign of flagging yet, and we're going to keep him going for another hour here, and a later hour with the graduate students. So I'm going to let Professor Friedland tell the rest of this story. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And you left out the fact that you were a graduate student of mine way back. And it's a pleasure to be back at the University of Manitoba. I'm going to, hard to know what to talk about. Coming in, I should have asked former Dean Penner how one talks about one's memoirs, because it's hard to do without talking about yourself. And so I apologize that the talk is centered on my own work, but if one writes a memoir and then is asked to speak about it, it's hard to avoid talking about oneself. What I'm going to do is talk about two articles that changed my career and my approach to the law. One article is on bail, written by an American law professor, Caleb Foote, published in 1961. And the other is one that I authored in 1981 on two competing criminal codes. And through an analysis of these two articles, we'll have covered the essence of what I say in my memoirs, and you won't have to read the book because we now know what the last sentence says about me, my wife and I moving to the, quote, terminal warehouse for our retirement. The first article is by Caleb Foote, and I found it in federal probation. I was teaching at Osgoode Hall, and I was preparing material for a course on criminology that I had to give in the spring, my first year of teaching. And by chance, I came across it. It was called The Bail System and Equal Justice. And it was about groups of law students who had investigated bail practices in Philadelphia and then in New York, and wrote articles about those practices, doing empirical research, actually looking at cases in the courts, in the Pennsylvania Law Review where Caleb was teaching at that time. And I found it an eye-opening exercise, one that very few, if any, law professors had engaged in Canada, that is, counting cases and going into the courts to see what was actually happening. By chance, sociologist Hans Moore, who later was teaching at Osgoode Hall Law School, had asked if he could sit in on my criminology course, and we would talk about criminology before and after class. He was also at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, and he made the point that how can you talk about the criminal law or the law without knowing how it works in practice? So I decided I would do an empirical study of the bail system in Canada by looking at what was happening in the Toronto magistrates' courts. They're now called provincial courts, but at that point it was magistrates' courts. And I took, I didn't know how to do the sampling. I'd taken a course in statistics and commerce and finance, which fortunately, I learned there that the more cases you take, the more accurate the result and the predictive value of your study. So we took all the cases over a 6-month period in the Toronto Magistrates Courts, 6,000 cases in all, and we collected material on them from the court documents. The police gave us access to their files. We had access to their police records. We had access to legal aid records. We had access to bail forfeitures. So we had maybe 20 sources of information that came through. We did not do a prospective study. It was all retrospective. And the reason for that is, as I say in a very pretentious note at the beginning of the book, Detention Before a Trial, that's the Heisenberg principle. If a law professor goes into court to observe what's going to happen in court, that law professor will affect what happens in court. So it's hard to do a prospective study. And moreover, this way we could do cases that had already been completed. So we did that study, and it got a lot of attention because it was the first time people had studied any aspect of the criminal justice system in the country in that way. 85% of persons who were arrested were held in custody until their first court appearance. About 2/3 of the persons who appeared for their first court appearance could not raise the bail that was set. There was a reliance on money, not on sureties. So we used the American system of money, but the British system that prevented bail bondsmen. And that many pleaded guilty in these circumstances without a lawyer. So we had a number of recommendations to change the system, eliminate the concept of money or security in advance, allow the police the power to release people before trial, set one of our conclusions was the effect of custody on not only sentence. You can understand it on sentence. Person's already in custody. It's not hard to send them back into custody, but also on the outcome of the trial, trying to equalize the cases in comparing them. And that book was published in 1965, Detention Before Trial, my first book, that came directly out of Caleb Foote's article. Because I had been working on collecting material on these cases, by chance, there was a group called the Joint Committee on Legal Aid. It was a committee of the government and the benchers of the Law Society. That's why it was called the Joint Committee. And they were going to look at legal aid in Ontario. With the help of several excellent law students, I did the background study for the committee, the Joint Committee, on delivery of legal aid across Canada and other common law countries. And I point out the importance in all the work that I've done of research assistance. Certainly there, on the bail study, I must have had 10 research assistants. The bail study, I got a grant for $5,000 from Osgood Hall, from the benchers, really, from the Law Society that controls legal education at the time, and did that whole study for $5,000. The Joint Committee on Legal Aid supported the hiring of a couple of research assistants, and we produced quite a decent report looking at what was happening in England and in the United States and in other jurisdictions. Over the years, I've had about 150 research assistants, and in my memoirs, I dedicate the memoirs to my research assistant. So I had good data for the Joint Committee on persons who were not represented by a lawyer, and most weren't. The total amount devoted to legal aid in the province of Ontario in the early 1960s was only $20,000. I mean, today it's about $300 million in Ontario. And in the chapter of the memoirs where I deal with this, I give an example of how legal aid was handled at that time. I had graduated from law, got my call to the bar in 1960, and one of my fellow graduates was Joe Pomerant, who was from first-year law school, was interested in criminal law. And a couple of months after we had graduated, he said that he had his first murder case. He had just graduated. And he handled that murder case on his own. Somebody had been stabbed, a woman had been stabbed to death. 8-day trial, conviction, sentenced to be hanged, took the appeal to the Ontario Court of Appeal. By majority, it was upheld, and then the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the sentence. He got nothing. It was just pro bono. Didn't have an assistant to help him. The government paid for the transcript in the Supreme Court of Canada and in the Court of Appeal. But it shows how far we've gone in the last 50 years when that was a standard murder case in Canada in those days. That that study had good results. The Joint Committee recommended that the government fund a law society to do work on to administer a legal aid system, and that slowly increased in the value of what they were doing. The type of legal aid introduced eventually duty counsel, and there are about 80 clinics in Ontario. The bail study, that took a little longer for it to be implemented. It was implemented through the We Met Committee that reported in 1969. They have a chapter on bail written by the great criminal lawyer, later the great judge, G. Arthur Martin, in which he had made similar recommendations and used the material from detention before trial. So in 1971, John Turner, the Minister of Justice, decided to change the bail system. His young administrative assistant Erwin Kotler organized the team that would draft the legislation, and that legislation came in and was well received. Probably went a little further than it should have, and there was a reaction. Once there was some incidents, and there's a reaction, and then the government went too far the other way. So it's a lesson not to claim too much initially, and you may be better off. The change was to shift the onus onto the accused to show that he or she should be released. Cases, and we keep widening the number of cases in which that applies. In addition, I did work for the We Met Committee because of my work in the magistrates' courts, on magistrates' courts, functioning in facilities. And I went across the country. I remember visiting the Manitoba courts here in the mid-60s, and made recommendations which the We Met Committee adopted on raising the status of the magistracy. I went actually further than they were willing to accept, and said it doesn't make sense that we have these levels of courts. The important work is being done by the trial courts. Why don't we merge the criminal courts, just as they later merged the family law courts? But there was strong reaction to that. As I say, the We Met Committee wasn't interested in that recommendation. We Met was a Superior Court judge, and so there's always that tension between the Superior Court judges and the provincial court judges. Another study that came from that same type of empirical research that I was doing was into changing the county court jails and for new facilities. And over the years, these regional detention centers have come in. As it turns out, I'm not sure they're that much better. They're often far removed from centers of population, so that makes it hard for the accused to consult with counsel and see relatives. So all in all, the 60s, the 1960s, was a productive area of criminal law and other legal reforms. And because of these projects and the work that I had been doing on securities regulation, I became interested in techniques of law reform. And I started a study in 1967 with an SSHRC grant on law reform and techniques of law reform. I had a sabbatical, my first sabbatical coming up, and I went to England and spent time with the English Law Commission and wrote material on law reform, which I thought would eventually result in a book on law reform. What it did result in was that I had some expertise on the subject, and when Turner and others wanted to establish a law reform commission, I did a paper for the Department of Justice based upon my knowledge of the English system. Eventually, legislation was introduced, and I was appointed as one of the so-called young tigers on that first law reform commission. The commission was mainly concerned with criminal law. 5 out of the 6 initial projects were criminal law projects. It was set up to tackle criminal law. Pat Hart, Superior Court judge in Ontario, was the chair or the president. Tony Lemaire was the vice chair. Jerry Laforêt became one of the commissioners. And we produced terrific material and had great plans. Unfortunately, I must say, just at that point, and unexpectedly, the Toronto deanship came up, and I was asked to be the dean. I was hoping to stay for 3, maybe even 5 years in Ottawa, but I accepted the call and came back, and I don't know how that affected the future work of the Law Commission, because at that point, in the initial group, I was the one that had the experience in managing large quantities of material. But I kept some interest in some of the things that I had been working on in that year, and one of them was that study that Anne mentioned on access to the law. It's called Access to the Law, a study for the Law Reform Commission of Canada. The commission, and I was part of that group, was concerned about citizens' access to the law. So as dean, I was able to do this study back in Toronto, trying to make the law more accessible to the general public. And the principal recommendation of that report, which was again an empirical study of how people get access to the law, whether they're able to read statutes and update statutes. The principal recommendation was to have an encyclopedia of laws which would be available in libraries and legal clinics and other places. Sorry that I don't usually lecture in the morning and at noon and then afterwards. Very little came of that. The law became somewhat more accessible through some of these ideas, but the central idea wasn't adopted. I came back to that about 10 years ago and tried to do another project similar to that now that we had the internet, because what I had found was the internet hadn't done much to make the law accessible in the sense of integrating federal and provincial laws and explaining the law not just to lawyers and law students, but in a form that the general intelligent lay person or perhaps an intermediary such as an accountant or a pharmacist or other people that are giving legal information could understand. We were continuing to leave it to the commercial publishers. The one thing that we did do, and we did do this well, was to make primary legal material more accessible. And things like Can Lee from the University of Montreal are fabulous ways of doing it. So all of these projects follow a continuous, clear line, which is the point that I wanted to make, that one's career seems to be quite random, but one thing does lead to another, although there are things like finding the Caleb Foote's article or what I'm going to talk about next that change things. But that's life itself. In my memoirs, I talk about some of the accidental factors, going to Cambridge rather than London, as I had planned, and more importantly, choosing my field of postgraduate study. Everyone here has similar stories. I planned to go to London and attend the University of London with the Sweeten Maxwell Scholarship. Sweeten Maxwell had wanted me to go to Cambridge, but my wife and I wanted to live in London. When I got to London, I called the head of University College law program. This was on a Saturday morning, and said, "I'm here from Toronto. Going on to the continent on Monday, but I just wanted to let you know I'm here." Well, I got the reaction you would expect. You don't call a professor at home. You don't call the professor on Saturdays. Come in and see me on Monday. And it was, the whole thing was kind of embarrassing, and I decided in the spur of the moment that I would take up the Cambridge offer because they wanted me to go there, and I then went to Cambridge. And then in Cambridge, I went to see the master of the college that I had chosen Trinity Hall, because they said, "Which college would you like?" And I said, "Which is the closest to the law library?" And they said, "Trinity Hall." And that's where I went. Sir Ivor Jennings. My interest, in fact, was not in criminal law. My interest was in international law. I thought maybe I'd come back and do work in international law, possibly join the Foreign Service as people did in those days. And I went to see Sir Ivor Jennings and said, "Here I am. I'm from Toronto. I'd like to do international law, study with you." And he said, "Well, my dear Friedland," he said, "I'm not the international lawyer. I'm the political scientist. There are two Jennings in Cambridge, myself and R.Y. Jennings. He's the international lawyer." I assumed that there had only been one. So I went away and looked up R.Y. Jennings and concluded that he wasn't as distinguished as Sir Ivor. I was wrong, of course, because he ended up as the president of the World Court. And I went to the second name on my list, which was Glanville Williams, and went to see him and said, "I'm from Toronto. I'm come to study with you." And he said, "What are you interested in studying?" I said, "What are you working on?" And he said he was working on the second edition of his great book on criminal law, the general part. So I then picked a subject in the area of criminal law and did my doctorate on, or it wasn't a doctorate at that point, I was going to just be there for a year, on double jeopardy, and that's how I became a criminal lawyer rather than an international lawyer, and that's why it's called My Life in Crime and Other Academic Adventures rather than My Life as an International Lawyer and Other Academic Adventures. So I came, there was another fortuitous event that occurred, and that was Osgoode Hall Law School was having trouble getting law teachers. So they approached a number of people that were graduating that year, myself, Harry Arthurs, Al Linden, and said, we were all going off to do graduate work. We all had scholarships. They said, "We will match that scholarship if you come back and teach for only 1 year. Boy, that was such a good deal, tax-free, an extra $3,000, which was big money. I took it, and my wife and I bought one of those sleek Sunbeam Alpines, the one that James Bond used in his first movie, and we toured the continent that first summer and the second summer, and we had a grand time because we were rich, actually, with those two scholarships. And I came back, and I was teaching for 1 year, and then it turns out that I was concerned that everyone would have thought that I took that $3,000 from the Law Society only to get that Sunbeam Alpine, which was true, but I decided I would teach a little longer, and maybe I'd go back to Cambridge and finish up my the residence requirement for a doctorate, just in case I wanted to stay in the academic world. But I really thought I was going to go out and practice or do something else and not stay in the academic world. So I went back to Cambridge, and meanwhile I had all this bail material that I had been collecting for that previous year. And I came to Glanville and said, I'm changing my thesis topic from double jeopardy to bail. He says, you can't do that because you've had a year's investment in double jeopardy. Put the bail thing aside and do double jeopardy, and you'll finish both. Well, easier said than done. As it turns out, it was the toughest few years. I had to work on double jeopardy there. Then I put double jeopardy aside because it wasn't time sensitive. Finished the bail study in '65, got back to double jeopardy, and it turns out Glanville was right. I ended up as a young law teacher with 2 significant publications. I couldn't do that today, putting all the eggs in a book. Today, the young teachers have to produce lots of articles as they're going on, which nobody seemed to care about in those days. Let me go on and say something about the second article. And I'll be very brief on this. The second article is the one that I talked about this morning, and that is R.S. Wright's Model Criminal Code, a Forgotten Chapter in the History of the Criminal Law. It's my favorite article. I loved talking about it this morning. It came about in this way. I told you that I'd gotten that grant from the SSHRC in 1967 to do a book on the law reform. After I stopped being dean, I decided I would go on sabbatical and finish that book on sabbatical. And so I spent 4 months in Israel and 6 months in Cambridge. I sent all my files to England, but I took one file with me to Israel. And I'm sitting on the balcony of our lovely apartment that we'd rented overlooking the Mediterranean in the seaside town of Netanya, and I'm working on an article or a chapter on codification, and it was working well. I was getting through it, but there was one footnote that I couldn't complete there, something about R.S. Wright's Code for Jamaica. R.S. Wright was the person that eventually became a judge, a very fine English judge. And I could find nothing about it. And somebody at the Hebrew University said to me, when you get to England, go to the Public Records Office, and you'll find some answers to Wright's Code and you'll find it interesting. I'd never worked in the public records office. When we got in the new year to Cambridge, I went down to the public records office in Kew, and I found that there were lots of records, Colonial Office records, Lord Chancellor's Office records, and I could fill out that footnote. Turns out it was, I had hit a gold mine for myself, and that footnote turned into the possibility of a short article on Wright's code, and that turned into something. And in the end, the article was published in the first journal of the Oxford Journal, first issue of the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies in 1981, with 324 footnotes. And so that's all I did on the sabbatical. It was worth it. I never did complete my project, even though I'd had that grant in 1967 and then a later Donner grant in 1981. But, and this is, I got out of it alive because apart from that article, a very important article, I was able to collect material and essays on criminal law reform, in which the R.S. Wright article was the very first article. In the class this morning, I said why the article was so important to me. And it was important because it opened my eyes, just as it apparently opened Anne's eyes, to the nature of legislation. That we study a statute in law school and we assume that it was inevitable, and we don't question how it came about, and yet it's always a reflection of the person behind the statute, the draftsman, the person promoting it. And here I had two models: Wright's Code for Jamaica, which wasn't just for Jamaica; it turned out to be a much more important code. It was for all of the colonies, which the permanent officials in the Home Office and the Colonial Office thought was much better than James Stephen's code, and they didn't like Stephen's code. Moreover, it turns out that Stephen was asked to review and revise Wright's code in the 1870s, and while he was doing that, he had decided to draft his own criminal code, which he did. Some of you remember the history of this. Then that was given to Lord Blackburn in a commission to explore the criminal Stephen's code. Stephen was a member of it, but it didn't get through the English legislature, but we adopted it in Canada. And here I found that these two criminal codes, and you could see as you explored the differences between them, how a code is a reflection of the drafters. I'll give you just, I don't have time for very much more than a few illustrations. Wright was a 31-year-old barrister and fellow of Oriel College, Oxford, who was a radical. Not a wild radical, but he believed in the nationalization of land and the elimination of the House of Lords, and promoted women's issues and women's rights. Stephen was very conservative, was an elitist, was against the extension of the franchise. And you can see how that plays out in the way they drafted their codes. Take the offense of sedition. Wright's code says sedition is when you do something by criminal means. you try to change the political system. Stephen doesn't require illegal means. If you try to agitate the public against the government, it's a sedition. So it's a much broader definition of sedition. Wright was very important in the labor movement and supported the trade union Congress and wanted them to get into politics. So he wanted to eliminate common law conspiracy, which was being used to thwart the development of the labor movement. Of course, Stephen didn't think much of the labor movement, and so he had common law crimes and common law conspiracy, which would be a conspiracy not just to commit an offense, but to commit a summary offense, or even to commit a tort. So you can see it playing out there. Or in morality in the criminal law. Stephen's code has buggery and bestiality as life imprisonment with hard labor, a 10-year minimum. Wright's code tucks them away under a section called nuisances, which is maybe as far as he felt. Probably he would have eliminated the offenses, but felt he couldn't go any further. Differences in the way they approach offenses such as abortion. Stephen would limit abortion to cases where the mother's life is in danger. Wright would be much broader than that, supportive of women's issues. Turns out that he was on the board of directors of the new Girton Women's College in Cambridge and gave all his Oriel College money, £300 a year, to Girton College. So the article was important in my approach to the law, and it also led to the 3 murder books, true crime books that I wrote. The one on Israel Lipsky came directly from the Wright-Stephen story because I was interested in Stephen and had seen that one of his cases was the murder charge against Israel Lipsky. And so when I got that, I got the Home Office records, and that book wrote itself. And it made the same type of point that I was making in the R.S. Wright story. From the preface to the Lipsky book, the story will place one trial in the context of the social, political, and economic conditions of the time. A trial may in theory be an objective pursuit of truth, but in practice there are many subjective factors which influence the course of events. Justice may in theory be blind, but in practice she has altogether too human a perspective. The Lipsky story is no doubt more dramatic, and the wealth of material richer than in most cases, yet by looking at this extreme example, one can better understand some of the factors that may influence any criminal trial: the personality of the judge, the adequacy of counsel, the reaction of the press, the cry of popular opinion, the vulnerability of the government, and many more. I loved writing that and wondered whether it was just an accident, and that was a unique case. So I went out to try to find a Canadian case through the files in Ottawa that would allow me to try to repeat that, to try and find a case with some political overtones that would look at the nature of the judicial process. And I found the case of Valentine Shortis. Then to complete the trilogy, I said, well, I'll see if I can find the American case. And I found a 1905 case that was the O.J. Simpson trial of the century. It involved Old Man Rice, who was the founder of Rice University, who had been found murdered in New York City, and the question was he murdered, and did his lawyer forge his will to give him the money? So the books turned out to be a good trilogy. Each appeared to capture the essence of the society in which the case occurred. As I stated in the preface to the third book, the Lipsky story is one of class and prejudice in England. Shortis is about race and religion in Canada, and the Patrick Rice case is about wealth and ambition in the United States. All three books look at the historical events in a wide context, examining the trial in the context of the social, political, and economic conditions of the time. As I stated, the three books illustrate the inherent fallibility of the trial process and the constant danger of error. Now, those three books then led to my writing the history of the University of Toronto, because the committee that was established to select the person was composed of people who, by chance, had read one of my true murder books and could say, well, this guy tries to tell an interesting story based on fact with some drama in the story itself. And I had told them that I would use the same writing style, the same techniques of research as I did on my other books. I'm now trying my hand at a novel, following former Dean Penner in that way, because neither of us have to account to a dean about what we're doing. It's a Second World War story coupled with a Holocaust story, which, again, came out of the history of the University of Toronto, where I had written about a graduate of the law school in the Second World War who was dropped behind enemy lines, a brilliant Rhodes Scholar, one of U of T's highest achievers. And as dean, I had never heard of this person. Anyway, that's leading to the novel. Same type of research. I've got the same piles of books on my desk, trying to work my way through it. I have no idea whether it's any good. Nobody has looked at it yet. I'm far enough along that I'll finish it. And it's achieving one objective that I'm learning, as I do in all of these books, great amount about the period of time that I'm writing about. So stay tuned. So I'll end there. My main theme is then continuity of one's career coupled with the inevitable accidental shifts in one's plans. And I use those two articles that influenced me to illustrate that type of a shift. Good.